Welcome to Study Faith with AI, where we use the power of AI to help you explore the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
I'm Meg Jensen.
And I'm Paul Carter.
And we're Google AIs. Whether you're a lifelong member or just starting to learn about the church, we're here to dive deep into its history, beliefs, and culture.
So if you're ready to learn, you're in the right place.
That's right.
Let's get started. Okay, so today we're really diving deep. We're looking at the education of Joseph Smith Jr., the founder of Mormonism. And, well, specifically, we're going to be exploring this Dartmouth Connection. It's this idea that the intellectual environment, the stuff happening around Dartmouth College, might have played a role, in how Mormon theology developed early on, especially through his brother, Hyrum.
Yeah, it's super interesting. It's one of those areas where you've got real historical investigation bumping right up against seriously deeply held beliefs. So for some folks listening, Joseph Smith's inspiration, that's a matter of faith. Right? But for others, figuring out where his ideas came from is the big question. We're not here to say who's right or wrong, but we are going to dig into the historical stuff, see what those sources can tell us about the world, the intellectual world that the Smith family was a part of.
Yeah, exactly. We've got some really cool stuff to work with today. We've got this academic article. It takes a whole new look at, how much formal schooling Joseph Smith Jr. actually had. And then we've got these transcripts from a whole podcast dedicated to unpacking this Dartmouth connection. Pretty wild, huh?
Yeah, it's a lot.
So the core question we're trying to answer is, Hyrum was involved with Dartmouth directly. The family lived near there. So how much did that intellectual atmosphere, that whole vibe, how much did it shape those first stages of Mormonism? Our mission today is to pull out the important insights about Joseph Smith's education, how it might connect to the way Mormon doctrine came about, and we're sticking strictly to what our sources say. Okay, so first let's look at Joseph Smith Jr.'s education itself. Now, people often assume he wasn't really educated, right?
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting how that whole idea has been used. Our academic source points out that people who believe in Joseph Smith's teachings, they sometimes use the fact he didn't have a ton of schooling to be see, this is proof that God was involved in the Book of Mormon. But then people who are skeptical, they use it to argue against the Book of Mormon. They say his ideas couldn't have been that sophisticated.
Right. So the truth is somewhere in the middle.
Huh? Seems like it.
Yeah. One of the first things our academic source really emphasizes is the culture of education within the Smith family itself. So it wasn't just a family that totally disregarded learning. His father, Joseph Sr., he was a school teacher, a professional one.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
Yeah. And then his mother, Lucy Mack Smith, she came from a family where education was important. Her mom, Lydia Mack, was a teacher too. Back then, mothers were seen as the main educators for young kids. They were the ones responsible for teaching morals and laying the foundation for learning. So Lucy probably had a big part in Joseph's early education.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And you know how people say Joseph didn't go to school at all? Well, that's not totally true. We've got evidence that he did go to school, just at different times. Our academic source lays it all out like a timeline. It starts in Royalton, Vermont. He was there probably between 1809 and 1812. So 4 to 6 years old.
Right.
Which back then was when kids usually started school. He could have gone for multiple terms there.
Interesting.
So then the family moved to West Lebanon, New Hampshire, around 1812 to 1814, or maybe 1815. And this is important because, Dartmouth College was right there. Plus, Joseph had that leg surgery, right? Done by doctors from Dartmouth. Later, he went to school in Palmyra, New York, from 1817 to 1821, then Manchester, New York, up until 1825, and finally South Bainbridge, New York, in 1825 and 1826.
Wow. So he moved around a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Makes sense the schooling wasn't super consistent then.
Right. And life was tough for the Smith family. They dealt with sickness, they moved a bunch, and the kids had to work on the farm. All those things definitely interrupted Joseph's education.
Yeah, that makes sense. And even Emma Smith, Joseph's wife, apparently, she said that he struggled to write a good letter. But then there's the Book of Mormon, which is so complex that suggests that people back then also thought his literacy was limited.
Yeah. And then, Joseph himself said in his own history in 1832 that he was merely instructed in reading, writing, and the ground rules of arithmetic. But our source, the academic one, says we shouldn't take that literally. Back then, that phrase, reading, writing, and arithmetic, it was basically shorthand for a very basic education. It might have been a common way of saying you didn't have fancy opportunities without meaning he learned absolutely nothing else.
That's a really good point. Plus, He owned textbooks, like Lindley Murray's English Reader, Charles A. Goodrich's A History of the United States of America, and Thomas T. Smiley's Sacred Geography. Those aren't simple books. Those covered history, geography, even rhetoric. So maybe when he described his education, he was playing it down, you know? Maybe he was more focused on the fact that he didn't go to school for a super long time instead of saying that he didn't learn anything beyond the basics.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
And if you add up all the different times he went to school, our academic source thinks it could have been somewhere between 3.5 to 6 years total. Plus, he was in a debate club in Manchester, which shows he was interested in learning, in engaging with ideas, and in getting better at talking to people.
Oh, for sure.
And get this, it wasn't even weird for a 19-year-old like Joseph was in South Bainbridge to still be going to common school, especially if their earlier education had been all over the place.
Yeah.
So the picture of his schooling is more complicated than just saying he was uneducated.
Yeah, definitely seems that way.
Okay, so now we have a better understanding of Joseph's own education. Let's move on to his older brother, Hyrum, and this whole Dartmouth connection. Our podcast source really focuses on how much influence Hyrum might have had. What do we know about Hyrum's education?
Well, from what our sources say, Hyrum went to this academy in Hanover, which is Moore's charity school. It was connected to Dartmouth College. That was back in 1811 when the Smith family was living in Lebanon, New Hampshire. Moore's charity school was basically a fancy prep school linked to Dartmouth.
Gotcha. And it's wild how close the Smith family lived to Dartmouth during all this time. They lived in Sharon, Lebanon, and Norwich, all pretty close to Hanover where Dartmouth was. The podcast even points out that they were as close as 5 miles away at one point. So, like, Dartmouth's intellectual vibe would have been a huge part of their lives.
Oh, totally. And there's even this idea that Hyrum might have tutored Joseph Jr. after that leg surgery in the winter of 1812, 1813, because, Joseph couldn't go to school then. But Hyrum's connection to Dartmouth was much deeper than just tutoring. Later, he went to Moore Academy formally from 1811 to 1816. There might have been a break in there somewhere, but that's still a few years of education in that environment.
Yeah. And Dartmouth, in the early 1800s, it wasn't just a small local college. Our podcast source makes it sound pretty intense academically. They had this elite prep school, a medical school, and the actual college.
Yeah.
And to get in, you had to be able to translate Latin and Greek. That's a high bar, right? This wasn't just a place to learn basic stuff.
Right.
And this is where things get really interesting because the podcast talks about some important people at Dartmouth who were connected to the Smiths, either directly or indirectly. First, there's John Wheelock. He was the president of Dartmouth, and he was a big deal in shaping the curriculum, along with a guy named Dr. John Smith. Hyrum, being a student at Moore's, he probably interacted with President Wheelock somehow. And then there's Dr. John Smith. This guy seems super important. He was Dartmouth's first professor, librarian, and the pastor of the Church of Christ at Dartmouth. And get this, he was related to the Smith family. He was heavily involved in making the curriculum, and he gave these theological lectures that Hyrum would have definitely gone to as part of his education at Moore's.
Oh, that's a lot of connections.
Right. And then you've got Dr. Ethan Smith. He's the surgeon who operated on Joseph's leg. But he was also one of the founders of Dartmouth Medical School. And here's the kicker. He wrote this book called View of the Hebrews, where he argued that Native Americans were descended from ancient Israelites. The podcast source says Dr. Ethan Smith visited the Smith family a bunch of times.
Yeah.
Plus, his son, Lyndon Smith, was at Dartmouth at the same time as Hyrum. And then there's Dr. Nathan Smith, another surgeon who worked on Joseph's case, and another founder of Dartmouth Medical School. So many medical and intellectual connections right there in their lives.
Yeah, wow. So many potential points of contact with this intellectual center. But the podcast really focuses on the Church of Christ at Dartmouth. What's so important about that?
Okay, so the Church of Christ at Dartmouth was built back in 1771. It was a huge part of the college community. Dr. John Smith, the guy we talked about before, he was a pastor there. So as a student at Moore Academy, which was tied to Dartmouth, Hyrum had to go to theological lessons, both morning and evening. The podcast estimates that over the years he was there, Hyrum could have gone to over 1,000 of these lectures.
1,000?
Yeah, over 1,000. That's a ton of exposure to the theological ideas going around at that time.
No kidding. That's a lot to absorb.
It is. The podcast even compares the architecture of the later Kirtland and Nauvoo temples to the federal architecture that was popular around Dartmouth back then. They're suggesting Hyrum might have been visually influenced by what he saw there. And they bring up this really interesting idea that Hyrum, because he had more formal education, might have been like the real intellectual force behind early Mormonism.
So not Joseph.
Right, like Maybe we don't give Hyrum enough credit. You've got Hyrum getting this rigorous education steeped in theology and classical learning, and then you have Joseph, whose education was less formal and kind of all over the place.
Hmm.
It makes you wonder about their relationship, about how they shared ideas and knowledge.
Yeah, definitely. But the podcast also points out that in Mormon scripture, there are these negative things that God says about other churches, and that would have to include the churches connected to their relatives and Hiram's education at Dartmouth, right?
That's right.
It seems a little contradictory.
Yeah, it does.
But, I mean, I guess there are different ways to look at it. Some people might say it's God rejecting old religious ideas to make way for a new one. Others might say it's more about a new religious movement trying to stand out, trying to be different from the others that were already around.
That makes sense. Okay, so now the podcast goes on to talk about what it calls the 5 building blocks of Mormonism. And it suggests that Joseph Smith, even by the time he was 12, would have been exposed to these themes through his family, especially through Hyrum and what he learned at Dartmouth. Let's go through them. The first one is American Indigenous mythology. How does that fit in here?
Okay, so the podcast talks about how the Smith family lived near Native American historical sites. Plus, back then, people were really interested in where Native Americans came from in their history. And the book, View of the Hebrews, the one written by Dr. Ethan Smith from Dartmouth, that's given as a prime example of a popular book from that time that argued for a connection between Native Americans and ancient Israel. So the idea is that all these discussions and narratives were floating around in the culture and the intellectual world.
Right, so the second building block is Protestant Christianity, which, considering Dartmouth and Hyrum's theological background, seems like a very direct influence, right?
Oh, for sure. Dartmouth was steeped in theology. You had Dr. John Smith's lectures covering all these different Christian doctrines, and Hyrum spent more than 4 years immersed in all that. That would have been a really deep and constant engagement with Protestant Christian thought. They would have been talking about scripture, different denominations, all sorts of theological concepts all the time.
Yeah, that's a lot. Okay, number 3 is Greek mythology. How does that fit in with Dartmouth?
So back then, Greek mythology was part of classical education. And at Dartmouth, students had to learn Greek. So Hyrum would have had to read ancient Greek texts, which meant he was exposed to those myths and stories that were so important to their culture.
That makes sense. Number 4 is a little more surprising. Islamic beliefs.
Yeah.
How did those end up in the Dartmouth environment?
So the podcast suggests that when they had theological lectures or intellectual debates about different world religions, people like Dr. John Smith might have talked about the main ideas of Islam. Like it would have been part of a broader approach to studying religion. So maybe it wasn't a main focus, but it could have been something Hyrum learned about at Dartmouth.
Interesting. And the final building block is Masonic rituals. What's the connection to Dartmouth?
Well, get this. A Masonic lodge popped up in Hanover while Hyrum was at Dartmouth. And Dr. John Smith, the guy we've been talking about, he was the chaplain there. The podcast even mentions the word Deseret, saying it might have come from Masonic traditions. So it seems like Masonic ideas and practices were around the Dartmouth community, and Hyrum could have been aware of them.
So the argument here is that through Hyrum's education and everything going on intellectually around Dartmouth, Joseph Smith, even as a young kid, could have been exposed to this huge range of themes and ideas that later show up in Mormonism. Now, let's circle back to Joseph Smith himself and his intellectual abilities. Specifically, how does this all connect to the Book of Mormon? Our academic source has some interesting takes on this.
Yeah, it does. It points out that people who knew Joseph Smith, they gave conflicting accounts of how well he could read and write, his literacy and education. Some said he was basically illiterate or could barely read and write. But then you have this complex narrative like the Book of Mormon. It doesn't really add up.
Right. And our academic source makes this point, that the typical district schools back then, they didn't focus on teaching kids how to write creatively, write complex stuff, or speak really well off the cuff. So just from a practical standpoint, it's hard to see how someone with limited formal training in those areas could write something as long and complex as the Book of Mormon.
Definitely. But the article does bring up some things Joseph did outside of school that might have helped him develop his storytelling and speaking skills. He was involved in Bible studies, maybe Hyrum tutored him. He went to religious meetings where people shared their testimonies and preached. He was in that debate club. His family had storytelling traditions. And he even preached at Methodist meetings for a bit.
Oh yeah, and Lucy Mack Smith, she talked about how Joseph, even as a young man, would tell these incredibly detailed stories about the ancient people who lived in America It's like he was describing their clothes, their journeys, their cities, their wars, and their religion as if he had been there himself. That suggests a pretty creative and imaginative mind, even when he was young.
Yeah, that's a good point. That suggests he had the capacity to create these narratives. But it's worth noting that Joseph's younger brother, William, was skeptical. He didn't think Joseph could just come up with a history like that on his own. So even within the family, people had different opinions about how good of a writer Joseph was.
Yeah, and a lot of people who actually knew Joseph, they didn't say he was a great speaker, especially before and even after 1829. Some described him as awkward or not very fluent. Even Lorenzo Snow, who was a big deal in early Mormonism, he remembered Joseph just sharing his testimony, not giving polished sermons in those early days.
Yeah, it's tough to explain how he wrote the Book of Mormon if you just look at his intellectual skills and education in 1829. Our academic source says there's not much historical proof that he had the writing skills you'd expect for a book that big. Plus, a lot of people who knew him said otherwise.
Okay, so the secular viewpoint in the podcast, they offer a different perspective. They suggest that all the information floating around in Joseph Smith's world, especially the intellectual stuff coming out of Dartmouth that he might have learned from Hyrum, could explain the Book of Mormon. Like, you don't need to bring in supernatural explanation.
So we're back to the Dartmouth Connection again. The podcast argues that the sheer volume of ideas being discussed and debated around Dartmouth while Hyrum was there, plus the close relationship between the brothers and how they might have shared ideas, that all of that could have shaped the themes and concepts we see in early Mormonism.
Okay, so to wrap up our deep dive today, it seems like Joseph Smith probably had more education than some people think, even if it wasn't continuous or super formal. And Hyrum, being at Dartmouth, put the Smith family right in the middle of a really active intellectual scene during a super important time in their lives.
Yeah, but it's super important to remember that we've been focusing on possible influences and connections based on historical records and what our sources say. We haven't tried to say anything definitive about where Mormon theology came from. It's
No.
complicated, with lots of different viewpoints and interpretations.
Right.
It really is.
So, listener, thinking about everything we've explored today, the educational environment and this Dartmouth connection, how does all this change how you understand the beginnings of Mormonism? How does it change how you see Joseph and Hyrum Smith? What new questions do you have about how personal experiences, family influences, and bigger intellectual trends all come together to shape religious thought? It's a lot to think about, and we encourage you to keep exploring these topics. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
If you find value in this exploration, please like, share, follow, and consider becoming a subscriber. Your contributions help keep these conversations going and allows us to maintain the highest quality production. You can find all the details at studyfaithwithai.com. Thank you for being part of this journey.